Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to find you in this quiet hour. Tell me, is there something before you this evening? A letter, a document, perhaps a book left open and waiting? We rarely consider how much we trust the things we hold in our hands. Yet Watson knew that the most dangerous deceptions are often the most familiar ones, dressed in the ordinary and the expected. Do subscribe so each new inquiry finds its way to you. Now, settle in. For as reason teaches us, it is the discipline of refusing to see less that reveals the truth. You'll find the Watson's Margins Spotify link in the description below. Chapter 1. The Fog Upon the Embankment. There are mornings in London when the city seems to hold its breath, when the fog descends not merely as a meteorological inconvenience, but as a kind of moral condition, wrapping every lamp-post and iron railing in a gauze of ambiguity that discourages certainty altogether. It was upon such a morning in the latter weeks of November that I made my way from my rooms in Kensington to Baker Street, guided more by memory than by sight, for the yellow murk had reduced the familiar thoroughfares to suggestions of themselves, shapes rather than streets, impressions of cabs and horses and pedestrians moving through the muffled air like figures in a half-remembered dream. I had received no summons. Holmes had not telegraphed, nor had any message arrived to indicate that my presence was required or even desired. Yet I had found myself restless since breakfast, a condition I had long since learned to associate with some disturbance in the city's affairs that had not yet resolved itself into legible form. I dressed, told my housekeeper I should not return for luncheon, and submitted myself to the fog. Holmes was standing at the window when I entered the sitting-room, not looking out upon Baker Street, for there was nothing to look out upon, but rather listening in that peculiar attitude of concentrated stillness which I had come to recognise as a form of active thought. His hands were clasped at his back. His long frame was bent very slightly forward. He did not turn at my entrance, and Mrs. Hudson, who had admitted me with the comfortable familiarity of a long acquaintance, withdrew without further ceremony. "The fog thickens from the south," Holmes said without preamble or greeting. "There is a faint smell of the river in it this morning, unusual for this hour." "I noticed nothing in particular," I admitted, seating myself near the fire with some gratitude. "I was occupied chiefly with not walking into lamp-posts." "Quite so. Yet the city speaks, Watson, even when it cannot be seen, perhaps especially then. A city under fog as a witness made cautious." He turned at last, and I saw that his grey eyes held the particular quality of restrained animation that preceded engagement. He had not yet found his case, but he was listening for it. "I have been expecting a visitor for the better part of an hour." He was outside the door twice before deciding to knock, which suggests either excessive nervousness or a recent decision to proceed against an earlier resolution not to do so. Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson returned to announce Mr. Elias Harcourt, and a moment later there entered the sitting-room a young man of perhaps 27, dressed in the dark, professional attire of a legal clerk, his hat in both hands and his expression that of a person who has been arguing with himself for some days and has not yet arrived at a comfortable conclusion. He was slight, with careful posture and ink-stained fingers. His collar was precisely turned but had been straightened that morning with some haste, for a small crease remained at the left. He looked between us with a species of relieved desperation, as a man might look upon a harbour after a difficult passage. "Mr. Holmes," he began, and then stopped, as though the sentence had contained more confidence in the preparation than it could sustain in delivery. "Sit down, Mr. Harcourt," Holmes said, gesturing toward the basket chair. "You are junior clerk to Sir Julian Vane, of the Temple. You have come on your own initiative, not at Sir Julian's instruction, and you're not entirely certain you've done the right thing in coming. I should advise you to proceed. Whatever hesitation brought you to this door twice and retreated, set it aside. The matter is evidently serious, and you have arrived." The young man sat, and the colour came into his face with a degree of grateful surprise that I recognised from many such consultations. Holmes's method of proceeding could be startling upon first exposure, but it had the considerable advantage of moving a nervous visitor past the stage of self-conscious preamble. Harcourt confirmed that he was indeed junior clerk in the chambers of Sir Julian Vane, whom he described with the combined reverence and wariness that legal underlings often reserve for men of great talent and demanding temperament. Sir Julian was, by any account, one of the most formidable barristers of the day. He had built his reputation upon a succession of difficult appeals, several of which were spoken of in the legal press as masterpieces of forensic argument. His current engagement was the most prominent of his career, an appeal in a matter involving forged railway bonds and the consequent ruin of several respectable families. It was a case attended by considerable public interest, and Sir Julian's role in presenting it had been anticipated in the newspapers for some weeks. "It is the case itself," Harcourt said, leaning forward. "Sir Julian has become, in recent days, unlike himself. He has always been a man of formidable composure, but this past week he has been distracted, watchful, reluctant to be alone with the brief. He said to me on Thursday in a lowered voice, as though someone might hear him, that the case itself is tainted. Those were his words, Mr. Holmes. I didn't know what he meant, and he would not say more." "And you came to me because?" Holmes asked. "Because I am afraid something will happen to him before the appeal, and because I do not know who in the chambers I can trust." Holmes was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. Beyond the windows, the fog pressed its blank face against the glass. "Tell me of the other persons in the chambers," Holmes said, carefully and without omitting anyone you consider unimportant. The unimportant witness is frequently the most instructive. Harcourt gathered himself and proceeded. "There was Miss Beatrice Vane, Sir Julian's niece, who served also as his personal secretary, a young woman of considerable intelligence whose precise and methodical habits had made her indispensable to the chamber's organisation. There was Mr. Lionel Pritchard, a fellow barrister of somewhat lesser distinction, who had long been associated with Sir Julian's practice, and who appeared in Harcourt's telling to be the very model of collegial devotion, assisting where he could, smoothing difficulties, and generally presenting himself as a man in whom helpfulness had become a settled character. There was also Mr. Amos Rudd, the elderly chief clerk, a man of 30 years' service and visible anxiety, and beyond the chambers there hovered, as Harcourt put it, two figures connected to the railway bond case itself. Captain Mordaunt, a decorated and now ruined investor whose losses had been severe and whose temperament had not borne them with equanimity, and Lady Eveline Carow, a refined widow whose late husband had been disgraced in connection with the same scandal. Holmes asked several careful questions regarding the brief itself, the physical document in which Sir Julian's legal arguments resided, and whether it had recently been left unattended. Harcourt replied that the brief was ordinarily kept in a secure inner room, but that during the past fortnight, as the preparation intensified, it had passed through many hands. When Harcourt had gone, commissioned to arrange a visit to the chambers for the following morning, Holmes settled into his chair and pressed his fingertips together in that familiar arch of contemplation. "A barrister who fears his own brief," he said at last. "A colleague whose helpfulness never lapses. A case attended by ruined men and grieving women, and a fog that discourages certainty." He paused. "Watson, I think we shall find that the temple has more secrets in its stones than even its own antiquity supposes." I said nothing, for Holmes required no response at such moments. I looked at the fire and listened to the fog-muffled city outside, and thought of Sir Julian Vane, sitting somewhere in those ancient chambers with his red-taped brief before him, and the quiet, particular fear of a man who has begun to understand that he is in danger. Chapter 2. The brief in red tape. The Temple, that ancient enclave of courts and chambers tucked between Fleet Street and the river, has always struck me as a place that wears its history with a kind of deliberate gravity. Its stone staircases are worn smooth by the passage of centuries of legal industry. Its courtyards hold the particular hush of a place accustomed to the weighing of words, and the smell of coal smoke, vellum, and old timber that pervades its interiors seems less an accident of occupation than a considered atmosphere. as though the buildings themselves understood the nature of the work conducted within them and had arranged matters accordingly. Holmes and I arrived there on the morning following Harcourt's visit, the fog having thinned overnight to a pale winter haze that softened the outlines of the buildings without obscuring them. Harcourt met us at the gate and led us through 2 courtyards and up a narrow stair to the chambers of Sir Julian Vane, which occupied a suite of rooms on the second floor of a handsome but slightly faded building whose windows looked out upon a small garden of bare November plane trees. The interior confirmed what the exterior had suggested. Sir Julian's chambers were furnished with the prosperous restraint of a man who had earned his position rather than inherited it. The shelves were mahogany, deep and well ordered, carrying leather-bound legal volumes whose spines showed genuine use. 2 coal fires burned, one in the outer room where Harcourt and young clerks worked, and one in the inner consulting room where Sir Julian himself received clients. The chairs were substantial, the desk enormous, and clear of everything superfluous. It was the room of a man who thought methodically and disliked encumbrance. Sir Julian rose to meet us. He was perhaps 60, tall and spare, with the kind of controlled presence that courtrooms produce in those who survive them. His face was sharp-featured and authoritative, yet I noticed, as Holmes had perhaps anticipated, that behind the habitual composure there moved something else, a watchfulness at the eyes, a slight tension at the corners of the mouth. He greeted Holmes with the measured courtesy of a man who respects another's reputation without wishing to appear impressed by it. "I confess," Sir Julian said when we were seated, "that I was not entirely persuaded by young Harcourt's decision to consult you. I am not a man given to alarm." "And yet you told him the case was tainted," Holmes replied, with the easy directness he employed when he wished to move past the preamble of pride. A pause. Sir Julian settled back in his chair. "An imprecise word. What I meant was that certain aspects of the preparation have disturbed me. I do not readily disturb." "The brief, if you please," Holmes said. Sir Julian hesitated only a moment before reaching into the large iron-bound document box beside his desk, and withdrawing the object in question. It was a substantial bundle of foolscap and correspondence, bound with the red tape that gives such legal documents their distinctive and somewhat theatrical appearance. He placed it on the desk between us. Holmes leaned forward to examine it, his hands in his lap, touching nothing. I watched him look at it in that particular way of his, not with the eager scrutiny of a man searching for something he expects to find, but with the patient, comprehensive attention of one who has learned that observation must precede hypothesis, not follow it. His gaze moved across the document as a surveyor's instrument moves across unfamiliar ground. "Someone has retied this," Holmes said. "The bow is competent but not habitual. The right-hand loop is drawn before the left, which is the instinct of a right-handed person. Are you left-handed, Sir Julian?" "I am," Sir Julian said with some surprise. "Then you did not tie this. Who had access to the room yesterday afternoon?" What followed was an accounting of the previous day's movements. Harcourt briefly, Mr. Rudd in the morning, Miss Vane, who had been working at her own desk in the adjoining room until past 4 o'clock, and Mr. Pritchard, who had looked in twice on collegial business. No client had been received. Holmes thanked him and returned his gaze to the brief. He did not touch the pages, but he leaned close to one section near the middle of the bundle, and I saw his nostrils move almost imperceptibly. "There is a faint odour," he said, "upon the 7th or 8th page. Bitter, faintly chemical, not ink, not sealing wax." He straightened. "Watson, you may smell it, if you approach carefully without disturbing the arrangement." I did so. Holmes was correct. Among the familiar smells of good paper and dried ink there was something else, a faint acrid edge that I could not immediately place, but which suggested to my medical understanding a substance of deliberate origin rather than accidental contamination. I said as much. "Interesting," said Holmes. "And the paper knife, St. Julian?" The paper knife lay upon the desk, a long, slender implement of ivory and silver, handsome and well used. Holmes regarded it from his chair. "It has been moved," Sir Julian said, following Holmes's gaze with a slight frown. "It lives to the left of the blotter. It is now to the right." "Precisely, and Miss Vane's inkstand." We both looked toward the secondary desk where the inkstand in question resided. It was a handsome piece of cut glass with a brass lid, and the lid, I now saw upon closer examination, had been recently cracked along one edge and subsequently wiped in an attempt at concealment. The attempt was tolerably good. One would not have noticed unless one were looking, or unless one were Holmes. It was at this moment that Mr. Lionel Pritchard appeared in the doorway, having apparently just arrived at chambers, for he still carried his overcoat and hat. He was a man of 40 or so, moderately built, with an agreeable, unhurried manner, and the sort of face that invites the word pleasant without quite inspiring any stronger epithet. He expressed surprise at our presence with what seemed like entirely genuine goodwill, and listened to a brief account of our visit with attentive sympathy. "The retied tape," he said when Holmes mentioned it. "That was me, I'm afraid. I consulted the brief late yesterday to check the order of the exhibits. I hope I've not created confusion." "Not at all," Holmes said pleasantly. "And the inkstand?" Pritchard glanced at it. "I noticed the crack this morning, as a matter of fact. I assumed it had been knocked in the ordinary course of the day. I tidied the edge myself," he smiled. "I tend to straighten things. An old habit." "A most useful one," Holmes remarked. Sir Julian, whom I had been observing during this exchange, sat with his hands flat upon the desk. He said nothing, but I thought I detected in his expression a brief, involuntary conflict of something that resembled shame. Later, walking back through the temple courtyard, I asked Holmes if he had noticed it. "He suppressed knowledge," Holmes said without breaking stride. "Years ago, in a former case. He alluded to it obliquely and then retreated. A man who has carried a moral compromise for a long time develops that particular expression. Not of guilt exactly, but of a man who has made a transaction with his conscience and has never quite stopped paying the interest." The bare plane trees stood around us in the pale light. Somewhere above, a pigeon crossed the white sky. "Do you suspect the brief itself is dangerous?" I asked. Holmes was quiet for a moment. "I suspect," he said at last, "that what we saw this morning was an arrangement designed to be seen, and that the true arrangement lies elsewhere. The paper knife is a detail that Mr. Pritchard's convenient explanation addressed rather too promptly. A man who anticipates questions is sometimes a man who has prepared the answers in advance." We passed through the gate and into the street. I turned up my collar against the chill. Holmes said nothing further, but I knew from long experience that the silence was not emptiness. It was the particular silence of a mind already at work. Chapter 3. A Barrister Falls Silent. The message reached Baker Street at 10:30 the following morning, delivered by a boy in such evident haste that he had not paused to button his coat against the November cold. Holmes read it standing, handed it to me without comment, and was already reaching for his hat before I had finished the first line. Sir Julian Vane had collapsed in his chambers during a private preparation conference. He was alive, but could not speak with any coherence. A doctor had been summoned. Inspector Lestrade had been informed. We arrived to find the Temple in that peculiar state of agitation that a sudden crisis imposes upon an orderly place. Clerks standing in doorways, voices lowered to the register of concern, the ordinary rhythm of the morning suspended. Harcourt met us on the stair, his face pale and his composure sufficiently frayed that he had forgotten to remove his pen from behind his ear. Sir Julian had been removed to an inner room, and made comfortable on a daybed kept there for his occasional afternoon rest. A Dr. Ferrers, a local physician of apparently solid reputation, was still in attendance when we entered. Sir Julian lay propped upon pillows, his long face slack on one side, in a way that suggested some transient interference with his faculties rather than a permanent injury. He was conscious, and his eyes moved with evident intelligence. but when he attempted speech the words dissolved into something fragmented and effortful that conveyed alarm without information. "Doctor." Ferrers spoke quietly to Holmes and myself. The symptoms were not consistent in his view, with a stroke of the usual character. There was no pronounced paralysis, no alarming change in the pulse. He inclined toward the theory of nervous shock, or possibly some accidental contamination, he said carefully, indicating the brief, which still lay open upon Sir Julian's desk where it had been abandoned mid-session. He had not, he admitted, examined the papers themselves. I looked at Sir Julian's hands, folded now upon the blanket. There was a faint discoloration on the pad of his right thumb. Holmes was not attending to the patient. He stood near the centre of the room in that manner of his which looks, to the uninitiated, like distraction, but which I had long understood to be the opposite, a deliberate suspension of focus that allows the whole scene to present itself before any part of it is singled out. His eyes moved without haste across the desk, the grate, the window, the floor near the skirting board. Inspector Lestrade arrived within the quarter hour, bringing with him the particular quality of brisk certainty that characterized his best and worst moments equally. He was a lean, dark man of professional energy, and he had evidently already formed a hypothesis during the cab ride from Scotland Yard, for he produced it with the confident air of a man unveiling something well made. "Captain Mordaunt," he said, almost before he had removed his hat. "He was seen near the Temple yesterday evening. We have a witness who puts him within 50 yards of this building. He has made no secret of his feelings towards Sir Julian, and his letters, which we have had occasion to examine previously, are not the letters of a man who has mastered his resentment." Holmes made no objection. He asked Lestrade politely where the witness had placed Mordaunt, and at what hour, listened to the answer, and then resumed his examination of the room. I watched him. Near the grate he crouched briefly, and looked at something among the ashes without disturbing it. He rose, moved to the desk and regarded a glass that stood beside the document box, a plain water glass, clean, empty, and positioned with a slight awkwardness that suggested it had been placed rather than left. He looked at it for some seconds without touching it. At the window he examined the latch with a closeness of attention that required him to press his face nearly to the glass. From across the room I could see that the latch showed marks, though whether of recent or older origin I could not determine at that distance. "The window," Lestrade said, joining him. "Upper floor? Nothing came in or went out by that route." "Quite," Holmes said, in a tone that neither agreed nor disagreed. He returned to the desk and looked once more at the brief, then at the stain on its lower right corner, a brownish irregular mark on the outer page of the bundle that had not been there, to my recollection, on our previous visit. He studied it for a long moment, and I saw the line between his brows deepen by a fraction. Then he knelt beside the grate. With the tip of his pen he carefully lifted from the cinders a fragment of blotting paper, scorched at its edges but not entirely consumed, on which I could make out, though not read, the partial impression of handwriting. He set it aside on the hearth with the precision of a man who intends to return to it. I had by this point joined Lestrade near the door, who was outlining his theory with the controlled satisfaction of a man who has found his villain and requires only the formality of arrest to complete his mourning. Mordaunt had motive, he said. He had lost a considerable fortune in the railway bond affair, held Sir Julian personally responsible for certain legal decisions, and had not disguised his bitterness in several written communications. He had been seen nearby. The connection, Lestrade felt, was sufficiently evident. I confess that as I listened, the explanation seemed persuasive. Mordaunt's grievance was documented, his temperament suggested by his own correspondence, and his proximity to the scene was established. It was the kind of case that presented itself in satisfying outline. Holmes appeared from behind me. "Watson," he said quietly, "you will notice the thumb." I looked again at Sir Julian, now drifting into a shallow, troubled sleep. The discoloration on his right thumb was faint but definite, a residue of something transferred rather than naturally produced. I had noted it earlier as a curiosity, Now, with Holmes directing my attention to it, I looked more carefully. Sir Julian habitually read with his left hand, turning pages with the left, leaving his right hand resting or free. I had observed as much on our previous visit. "He reads left-handed," I said, lowly, so that Lestrade should not hear. "He does," Holmes confirmed, "which makes that mark a detail requiring explanation. A man does not acquire a contact stain upon the hand he keeps away from the page." Before I could pursue this, Lestrade materialised at Holmes's shoulder. "Well, Mr. Holmes, I take it you have found nothing to contradict the obvious conclusion." Holmes considered the room once more with the slow, comprehensive gaze of a man completing an inventory. "I have found several things," he said pleasantly. "Whether they contradict the obvious conclusion remains for the present an open question. The obvious conclusion is sometimes correct, Lestrade, but in my experience the elaborate crime does not often produce obvious evidence as its primary residue. It produces obvious evidence as its secondary residue, arranged precisely in order to be found." Lestrade received this with the tolerant scepticism of a man who has heard such remarks before and has not always been obliged to revise his conclusions afterward. He excused himself to pursue his inquiries regarding Mordaunt's whereabouts. When he had gone, Holmes stood for a moment looking at the sleeping figure of Sir Julian Vane. His expression was not unkind, but it was not sympathetic in the uncritical sense. It was the expression of a man who is assembling a picture in which the victim is not without a share of the surrounding circumstance. "My dear Watson," he said at last, pulling on his gloves, "simplicity is often the mask worn by the elaborate. What we have here is not a simple case in disguise. It is an elaborate case in the costume of a simple one. There is a considerable difference, and it matters a great deal to Captain Mordaunt." We descended the stair into the pale courtyard. I thought of Sir Julian's unmoving right thumb. I thought of the clean glass that no one admitted using. I thought of Holmes lifting that scorched fragment from the grate with the care of a man who already suspected what writing it had once carried. And I thought, walking out through the Temple Gate, that whatever the fog had concealed yesterday, today it had delivered something far more difficult. Not a mystery without evidence, but a mystery attended by a great deal of evidence, pointing with elaborate precision in a single direction. Chapter 4. The Wrong Man in the Fog. Captain Mordaunt was arrested on the Thursday afternoon, taken from his lodgings in a narrow street off the Strand, with what Lestrade afterward described as minimal resistance and maximum indignation. I heard the particulars from Holmes, who had received them by telegram, and who read the account with the studied neutrality of a man reserving his commentary for a more appropriate moment. The case against Mordaunt was, on its surface, formidably assembled. A witness had placed him near the Temple on the evening before Sir Julian's collapse. In his rooms, police officers had discovered a collection of newspaper cuttings pertaining to the railway bond appeal, a bundle of letters addressed to Sir Julian that had never been sent. Their language in the later specimen sufficiently intemperate to alarm any reasonable reader, and most damningly, a piece of red legal tape of the kind used to bind barristers' briefs, torn and crumpled and pushed to the back of a drawer as though discarded in haste. The newspapers received the arrest with the satisfaction that a resolved narrative always inspires. Here was a ruined man, a decorated soldier reduced to bitter lodgings and festering grievance, who had struck at the legal architect of his misfortune. The story accommodated itself to a familiar shape, and familiar shapes, in my experience, are what the press and the public find most readily convincing. Holmes said nothing about any of this for the better part of 2 days. He kept irregular hours, disappeared on one occasion for an afternoon without explanation, and spent a long evening with a quantity of reference volumes and a cold pipe. On the Friday morning he announced, over a breakfast he barely touched, that he wished to speak with the witness. The witness was a boy of perhaps 13 named Albert Finch, employed as a messenger for a firm of solicitors whose offices were situated near the entrance to the Temple. He had given his statement to the police with, by Lestrade's account, the directness and simplicity of a young person telling precisely what he had seen and nothing more. Lestrade had found him entirely credible. Holmes found him in the street outside his employer's offices, engaged in the consumption of a meat pie with the focused energy of the very young and the incompletely fed. He was a sharp-faced boy with clever eyes and the slightly guarded manner of a child accustomed to navigating adult authority without fully submitting to it. Holmes addressed him with the easy equality he invariably employed with the young and the poor, squatting to the boy's level against the railings with an unself-consciousness that I had always admired. "You told the police you saw a man in a military cloak," Holmes began. "I did," the boy said, "near the far gate, going at a good pace." "And you knew it was Captain Mordaunt because of the cloak?" "Everyone knows the captain's cloak," Albert said, with a slight emphasis on everyone that suggested he considered this self-evident. "The big dark one with the cape at the shoulder. He wears it every day. You see him about." "Quite so. And the man you saw, how did he walk?" The boy considered this with genuine seriousness, chewing. "Quick," he said. "Neat. Like he had somewhere to be." Holmes nodded, as though confirming something to himself. "Not stiffly? Not with any hesitation in the step?" The boy's brow contracted. "No, straight on, smooth-like." He paused, an intelligence moving behind his eyes. "The captain doesn't walk like that, does he? The captain walks stiff. His leg." "His right leg," Holmes confirmed. "Injured at my wand, I believe. A stiffness at the knee that produces a characteristic gait, particularly noticeable when the pace is increased. The man you saw walked smoothly." The boy looked at Holmes with the expression of a person who has just understood something they would rather not have to give back. "I saw the cloak," he said, more quietly. "I thought it was him." "You saw what you expected to see," Holmes said, without any unkindness. "It is a very natural thing. The cloak is distinctive. The cloak suggested the man, but the man inside the cloak moved differently." He straightened and gave the boy a coin of sufficient denomination to produce a moment of reverent silence. "You have been more helpful than the police, Albert, which is saying a great deal." We walked back through the grey afternoon, and I turned the thing over as we went. Mordaunt's cloak had been used by another man. The witness had identified the garment, not the wearer, and the red tape found in Mordaunt's drawer, the newspaper cuttings, the unsent letters. Holmes had said in the cab to the Strand that the evidence was almost too abundant, and now I began to understand what he meant. Each item was exactly what a guilty man might possess, arranged with the unfortunate thoroughness of a picture that has been composed rather than discovered. "Someone placed those things," I said. "Someone placed that piece of red tape," Holmes replied. "The letters and the cuttings Mordaunt possessed quite genuinely. They reflect his state of mind accurately enough. But a man who has committed a calculated act of this nature does not keep the physical evidence of it in a drawer. He burns it as someone burned a portion of the blotting paper in Sir Julian's grate. The tape is there because it was put there." "Then who wore the cloak?" "That," Holmes said, "is the question that will eventually resolve everything else. The cloak was borrowed or taken. Mordaunt is a man of solitary habits and irregular hours. He would not notice an absence from the Hook for an evening." I thought of Pritchard again, as I had several times during these past days, and not entirely comfortably. The image of him standing in Sir Julian's doorway, overcoat still in hand, producing a reasonable account of the retired tape with the smooth promptness of a man who had rehearsed his unremarkability, had not left me. Yet I could not make myself believe it. He had no apparent grievance. He had assisted the Chambers with what seemed like genuine devotion for years. He was, as I had told Holmes on the first evening, the most blameless person in the affair. Holmes, when I said this now, turned to look at me with an expression of mild interest. "You have said that twice," he observed. "I find it curious that Pritchard's blamelessness requires repetition. True blamelessness is rarely noticed twice." He said nothing further on the subject, and I was still arranging a response when we arrived at Baker Street to find that, in our absence, a note had been delivered by hand and left with Mrs. Hudson. Holmes read it at the foot of the stair, then folded it and placed it in his coat pocket without showing it to me, which was not his invariable practice, but was one I had learned not to question. He did, however, pause at the sitting-room door and make one observation without turning. The man without a visible motive, he said, is sometimes merely the man whose motive has been most carefully buried. What lies buried has the advantage, you see, of appearing absent. But absence is not the same as non-existence, Watson, and I have never yet found a criminal act entirely without its root. He went to his chair by the fire. I poured myself a whisky and soda and sat across from him, and thought about what it meant that Lionel Pritchard, in the course of several days' involvement with a matter concerning the near poisoning of his colleague, had not once, to my knowledge or Harcourt's, asked whether Sir Julian would recover sufficiently to speak. Outside, the street lamps came on one by one in the early dusk, and the city resumed its ordinary evening sounds, and I sat with the thought a while longer before I could be certain it was as significant as it felt. It was. Chapter 5. The Language of Habit. Holmes has remarked to me on more than one occasion that the investigation of crime is at its most revealing not when it concerns itself with the dramatic and the exceptional, but when it attends carefully to the ordinary. The exceptional act, he argues, is almost always embedded in a matrix of habit, and it is habit that betrays, because habit is the one behaviour a person cannot entirely alter under pressure. They may change their story, arrange their evidence, compose their expressions, and rehearse their replies. But the deeply ingrained patterns of daily conduct persist beneath these preparations like geological strata beneath a freshly levelled field. It was in this spirit, I believe, that Holmes spent the Saturday not in pursuit of new facts but in the quiet study of persons. He began with Miss Beatrice Vane, whom we called upon at her uncle's chambers in the mid-morning. Sir Julian remained confined to his rooms under medical supervision, and was not expected to receive visitors for some days. The chambers, without him, had a reduced quality, like a theatre between performances, the furniture present, the light adequate, but the animating purpose suspended. Miss Vane received us in the outer room. She was a woman of 30 or thereabouts, composed in her bearing with the practised steadiness of someone who has managed a demanding person's affairs for long enough that composure has become structural rather than performed. Her morning dress, for she had adopted a degree of dark dress since her uncle's collapse, was neatly kept, and she sorted a set of correspondence as we spoke, with the mechanical precision of hands performing a familiar task while the mind engages elsewhere. The papers moved from one stack to another at consistent intervals, each placed with exactness. A woman, Holmes had once observed to me, who sorts papers will reveal more about her inner state in the evenness of her intervals than in anything she says aloud. The intervals this morning were not entirely even. She confirmed that Sir Julian had intended in the course of the appeal to introduce a piece of testimony that would reflect poorly upon a particular family connected to the original railway bond matter. She was precise about this. It was not that he wished to cause harm, but that the legal argument required it, and Sir Julian had spent several weeks in private conflict over how to proceed. She was less precise about which family, and Holmes did not press her. "Was there anyone," Holmes asked, settling back in his chair with the ease of a man pursuing a casual conversation, "who might have known in advance exactly what Sir Julian intended to reveal?" Miss Vane set down the paper she was holding. "Mr. Pritchard," she said after a moment. "He assists with the preparation of arguments. He would have seen the drafts." Holmes thanked her and asked one further question, delivered with the same unhurried tone. Had she noticed, in the days immediately before her uncle's collapse, any alteration in Pritchard's manner toward the brief, any particular attention paid to it, or any occasion on which he had been alone with it for an extended period? She thought carefully. Then she said that on the Tuesday evening, when she had stayed late to complete a set of correspondence, she had seen Pritchard in Sir Julian's inner room as she passed the door. She had assumed he was reviewing exhibits, which was not unusual. She had not thought to mention it because at the time it had not seemed worth mentioning. Holmes thanked her again, and we took our leave. Mr. Amos Rudd we found in a small room at the rear of the chambers that served as his particular domain, a place of old deed boxes, reference ledgers, and the accumulated paper sediment of 30 years' practice. He was a small, stooped man whose age had given him the quality of a building that has settled into its foundations, stable, but visibly compressed. He offered us tea, which we accepted, and looked at Holmes with the wary attention of a man who suspects that the conversation is about something other than what it appears to be. Holmes asked him about the case ledgers for the period 6 or 7 years previous. Rudd's colour changed, by a degree that would have been imperceptible to most observers but was not imperceptible to me, in the way that a doctor learns to read involuntary physical responses as a second language running beneath the spoken one. He was quiet for what seemed longer than the question warranted. Then he said that certain documents had gone missing from chambers during that period, an entire set of correspondence relating to a property matter. He had reported the loss to Sir Julian at the time, and Sir Julian had told him to say nothing about it, that he would attend to it himself. He never had. Rudd set down his teacup with great care. He did not look at Holmes. "I should have pressed him," he said, "but one does not press Sir Julian. And you never discovered what became of the documents?" "I had my suspicions," Rudd said, "but suspicion is not knowledge, and I was not in a position to act on suspicion alone." Holmes did not ask him to name the object of his suspicions. He thanked him, finished his tea, and we left without pressing the matter further. On the stair, I asked Holmes why he had not pursued it. "Because I already know," Holmes said simply. We returned to Baker Street by way of Marylebone Road, and found, upon our arrival, that a visitor had been waiting in the sitting-room for the better part of an hour. Mrs. Hudson had settled her with the morning's paper and a pot of tea, both of which appeared to have gone largely unattended. Lady Evelyn Carrow rose when we entered. She was perhaps 55, a woman whose refinement was of the kind that persists through misfortune without becoming brittle, not hardened, but concentrated. She wore good clothes that were not new, and carried herself with the erect, deliberate posture of someone who has decided, at some point in recent years, that dignity is the one possession that cannot be taken without consent. She had come, she said, without announcement, because she had not been certain until this morning that she would come at all. Her husband, the late Sir Clement Carrow, had been publicly disgraced in connection with the railway bond affair, implicated in the original fraud through a chain of documentary evidence that had never, in Lady Carrow's view, been properly examined. He had died 2 years ago, in poor health and diminished circumstances, and the damage to his name had followed him to his grave. "Sir Julian wrote to me," she said, 3 weeks ago. He said he believed the truth might yet be spoken. Those were his words. He said he had found something in his preparation for the appeal that bore directly upon my husband's case. She placed an envelope on the table between us. Holmes took it and read the letter within, a single page in Sir Julian's formal hand. When he'd finished, he returned it to the envelope and set it down without any alteration in his expression. But I thought I saw, in the set of his jaw, a quality of confirmed expectation. "Did Sir Julian name the nature of what he had found?" Holmes asked. "He did not. He was always precise about what he committed to writing." She paused. "He was not, Mr. Holmes, a good man in all respects. He had treated my husband's case without the care it deserved years ago, and I believed for a long time that he had done so knowingly. But I think toward the end he was attempting to make what amends he could." After she'd gone, Holmes stood at the window for a time without speaking. The afternoon had grown overcast, and the light in the room was the particular flat grey of a London winter that makes all distances seem equal. "She hated him," I said, "and yet she came to tell us this." "Because she wants her husband's name restored more than she wants Sir Julian to suffer," Holmes said, "which is, in its way, a more formidable motivation than hatred. Hatred exhausts itself. The desire for vindication does not." He turned from the window. "We now know what Sir Julian found, Watson, and we know who could not afford for it to be spoken aloud. Tomorrow I should like to visit the court registry. There is one piece of this that I have not yet seen with my own eyes, and I prefer not to reason from assumption where I can reason from evidence." He was already at his desk writing before I had settled into my chair. I watched him for a moment, and then looked at the letter Lady Carrow had left behind on the table, and thought about what it meant to spend 2 years tending a dead man's reputation in the hope that one letter, from the man most responsible for its destruction, might at last begin to set things right. Chapter 6. The Second Brief. Holmes sent me to the court registry alone. This was not, I had come to understand over the years, an act of delegation so much as a deliberate division of labour. When Holmes dispatched me on an errand of this kind, it was not because he considered the task beneath him, but because he required me to see it fresh, without the accumulated weight of his own hypotheses colouring my observation. He wanted my report as a document rather than a confirmation, and he had learned, as had I, that what strikes the untrained eye as significant is sometimes precisely the detail that the trained one has learned to anticipate and therefore overlook. He remained at Baker Street with the letter Lady Carow had left behind, and a collection of documents he had procured over the preceding 2 days by means he did not specify, while I took a cab to the relevant offices and presented myself to the registrar's clerk with a letter of introduction that Holmes had written the previous evening. The court copy of Sir Julian's brief was produced after a delay of 20 minutes, during which I sat on a hard bench in a corridor smelling of sealing wax and institutional discomfort, and reviewed what I knew. The appeal concerned the original railway bond fraud. Several respectable families had lost substantial sums through the purchase of bonds subsequently proved to be forged, the forgery having been elaborate enough to deceive solicitors and investors alike for a period of nearly 3 years. Several persons had been prosecuted. Others had been implicated without formal charge, among them the late Sir Clement Carow. Sir Julian's role in the appeal was to argue on behalf of certain affected parties that the original prosecutions had proceeded on incomplete evidence, and that the full chain of fraud had never been properly examined by the court. It was, in short, a case that promised to disturb a number of settled conclusions, and to inconvenience a number of persons who had believed the matter safely resolved. The clerk returned with the brief, a copy substantially thinner than the original, comprising only the formal arguments and the supporting exhibits, rather than the full working document. I settled at the desk provided and read it with the methodical patience that Holmes had taught me by example, beginning not with the passages most likely to be significant but at the beginning, proceeding line by line without anticipation. I found the alteration in the 5th section, on the 19th page. It concerned an unnamed accomplice in the bond forgery, described in a previous draft, according to a marginal notation in the registrar's hand that recorded the original submission date as a legal professional acting in an intermediary capacity, whose role had been substantially softened in the final version. Where the original submission had employed language suggesting active participation, the final version offered something closer to inadvertent association. The effect was not to remove the unnamed party from the document altogether, but to reduce the weight of the accusation to something nearer a footnote. The alteration was cleanly done. A man unfamiliar with the earlier draft would find nothing in the final version to remark upon. I returned to Baker Street with notes rather than the document itself, and found Holmes exactly as I had left him, except that the letter from Lady Carow was now folded in his breast pocket, and the collection of documents on the desk had been supplemented by what appeared to be several years' worth of law list entries, 3 issues of a legal gazette, and a visiting card I did not recognise. He listened to my account without interruption, his eyes closed and his fingertips together, and when I had finished he was silent for a moment before asking 2 precise questions: whether the marginal notation specifying the original submission was in the registrar's hand or another's, and whether the softened passage affected only the unnamed party, or also the documentation attributed to him. I had noted both. The notation was the registrar's own. The softening affected the attributed documentation directly, reducing its evidentiary weight as well as the characterization of the party's role. Holmes opened his eyes. Then whoever made the alteration understood the legal consequences precisely. This was not a layman tampering with language he did not fully comprehend. The change is surgical. He rose and went to the mantelpiece, where he stood with his back to me for a moment. When you came in, Watson, you passed Pritchard on the stair. I had not mentioned this. You heard him? I heard the specific weight and cadence of a man who has called at this address before and is familiar with the stair. He did not knock. He reached the first landing and then descended and left. Holmes turned. He came to see how much we knew. It is a thing people do when they are frightened, and it is always a mistake, because coming tells us something that not coming would not have told us. I thought about what Holmes was saying, and about the marks of sealing wax and copying ink I had observed on Pritchard's hands during our second visit to the chambers. I had noted them and set them aside as an unexplained detail, one of the several that Holmes had accumulated without yet deploying. The time for deploying them was evidently approaching. I said, the alteration to the brief. Could Pritchard have made it? He had the access, Holmes said. Miss Vane placed him in Sir Julian's inner room on the Tuesday evening alone. He had handled the brief before and would have known its structure well enough to locate the relevant passage without difficulty. He had the legal knowledge to understand what needed to be changed and how to change it minimally, and he had the motive, which is the piece I've spent the past 3 days confirming. He produced the visiting card from his pocket and held it out to me. It bore a name I did not immediately recognise, Mr. Leonard Prentice, of a firm of solicitors in Bristol, now dissolved. Beneath the name, in Holmes's own handwriting, were 2 dates, one from 11 years previous and one from 9 years previous. Lionel Pritchard, Holmes said, watching me, is the name under which he has practised for the past decade. Leonard Prentice is the name under which he was involved as a junior legal intermediary in the original preparation of the fraudulent railway bonds. He was young and peripheral enough in the conspiracy that his name was not drawn into the subsequent prosecutions. The records of his involvement were among the documents that disappeared from Sir Julian's chambers 6 years ago, documents whose disappearance old Rudd reported and which Sir Julian chose not to pursue. The weight of it settled over the room. Sir Julian knew, I said. Sir Julian suspected, and then knew, and then did what such men sometimes do with inconvenient knowledge. He managed it rather than acted upon it. He allowed Pritchard to continue in the chambers, perhaps reasoning that the man had been peripheral, had not reoffended, and that the disruption of exposure was not worth its cost. It was, as I said to you that first evening, a transaction with his conscience. Holmes replaced the card in his pocket. What Sir Julian did not anticipate was that the appeal would require him to introduce into court the very material that Pritchard had spent 11 years hoping never to resurface. The unnamed accomplice in that softened passage, Watson, is Leonard Prentice, the legal professional acting in an intermediary capacity. Pritchard knew it. And when he understood that Sir Julian intended to speak it aloud, he acted. The fire had burned low while I had been away, and the room held a chill that neither of us had thought to address. I looked at the law list on the desk, and at the visiting card Holmes had returned to his pocket, and at the letter from Lady Carrow whose husband's name had been bent and broken in the wake of a conspiracy that one man had helped construct and another had helped conceal. "What now?" I asked. "Now," Holmes said, pulling on his coat. "I visit Pritchard's rooms, not to accuse him. I am not yet ready to accuse him, and in any case, accusation without the final piece is merely pressure, and pressure alerts a careful man. I go to see whether the final piece is where I expect it to be." He was at the door before he finished the sentence, and I was reaching for my own coat before he had completed it, because there are moments in working with Holmes when waiting for a formal invitation is simply not a thing one does. Chapter 7. Lestrade's Triumph. Pritchard's rooms were in a quiet street in Bloomsbury, on the second floor of a well-maintained terrace house, whose landlady answered the door with the composed certainty of a woman accustomed to professional tenants and regular rent. Holmes presented himself as a colleague of Mr. Pritchard's, with a document requiring his signature, a fiction so professionally delivered that I found myself momentarily uncertain whether it was one. She showed us up without hesitation. The rooms were precisely what the man had led me to expect, and yet there was something in their perfection that, now that I understood him better, I found more unnerving than any disorder could have been. The books were arranged by subject and then by height. The desk was clear except for a leather writing surface and an inkstand placed at an exact right angle to its corner. On the side table, a stack of legal papers sat in a neat block, their edges aligned, conveying the immediate impression of undisturbed industry. It was a room assembled with great care to appear unconsidered. Holmes moved through it quickly. He did not search in the conventional sense, opening drawers and lifting papers, but rather looked at the room as he had looked at Sir Julian's brief, comprehensively, with the unhurried attention of a man reading something that has already decided to yield its meaning. He spent a particular moment at the writing desk, examining the surface without touching it, and another at the side table, where the stacked papers received a scrutiny out of proportion, it seemed to me, to their innocent appearance. Then he straightened, glanced once more around the room and said quietly, "Enough. Let us go." In the street I asked what he had found. "The papers on the side table have not been worked upon for some days," he said. "The top sheet has a dust shadow indicating something was removed from atop it recently, an object roughly the dimensions of a document wallet. The blotter on the writing desk has impressions from 2 different hands, one consistent with normal correspondence, the other bearing the heavier pressure of a man copying rather than composing. A copyist leans differently, Watson. The angle of effort is not the same, and on the right-hand edge of the leather surface there is a faint trace of the same sealing wax I observed on Pritchard's hands at the chambers. Something was sealed at that desk." "The memorandum," I said. "A copy of the memorandum," Holmes corrected. "The original remains at the chambers, or did. What was sealed and removed from that table is almost certainly the document he intends to use if the situation turns against him further. A prudent man, our Mr. Pritchard. He does not merely act, he prepares for the consequences of acting." We returned to Baker Street in the early evening. Holmes ate nothing, which was not unusual when his mind was fully engaged, and spent 2 hours at his desk writing, pausing occasionally to consult the law list, or to reach for one of the legal gazettes he had accumulated. I read, or attempted to read, and at intervals I looked at him and thought that there are cases which announce their resolution dramatically and others which arrive at it, through a long careful convergence of small certainties, each one insufficient alone but collectively irresistible, and that this was emphatically the latter sort. It was the following morning that Lestrade arrived. He came at 9 o'clock, which for Lestrade indicated urgency, and he settled himself in the basket chair with the air of a man who has obtained what he set out for and is not reluctant to say so. He had, he told us, secured what he considered decisive physical evidence linking Mordaunt to the attack upon Sir Julian. A fragment of fibre had been found near the brief, dark wool, consistent with Mordaunt's military cloak. The analyst's report was confident. The fibre had been recovered from the floor of the inner consulting room, within 18 inches of the document box from which the brief had been taken for Sir Julian's preparation session. Combined with the witness placing him near the temple, Lestrade said, spreading his hands in the manner of a man presenting a completed calculation, and the items found in his rooms, I think we have our man, Mr. Holmes. A jury will find this sufficient." Holmes listened to all of it. He sat with his fingers laced and his expression composed into the attentive courtesy he invariably extended to Lestrade when he intended to allow a theory its full exposition before addressing it. When Lestrade had finished, Holmes said only, "A thorough case, Lestrade. You have assembled it with commendable efficiency." Lestrade received this with visible satisfaction, which I observed with a slight pang of unease, for I had long since learned to attend carefully to the precise register of Holmes's compliments. Commendable efficiency was not, in his vocabulary, the same thing as correctness. After Lestrade had gone, full of his triumph and the imminent certainty of a conviction, Holmes sat for some minutes in the stillness that follows another man's noise. Then he reached into the pocket of his dressing gown and produced a folded paper. "Come here, Watson." I crossed to him. He opened the paper on the arm of his chair. It was a rough sketch, made in his own hand, of Sir Julian's inner consulting room, with positions marked and labelled, the desk, the document box, the chair in which Sir Julian had been seated, the door, the window, and the grate. On the sketch, a dotted line traced the sequence of the preparation session as Holmes had reconstructed it from Harcourt's account. Brief retrieved from box, carried to desk, placed before Sir Julian, opened. Holmes's finger rested on a point midway along the dotted line. "The stained page," he said. "The page that Lestrade's entire case rests upon as the instrument of the attack. It is the outer page of the third section. In the normal order of preparation, Sir Julian would not have reached that page until he had worked through the first two sections entirely. At the pace his preparation sessions ordinarily proceeded, as Harcourt has described them to me, that would require 30 minutes at a minimum." He paused. Sir Julian was affected within 10 minutes of beginning the session. Harcourt heard him call out. He went in immediately. The brief lay open at the first section. I looked at the sketch. The implication arranged itself in my mind with the slow, settling clarity of something that has been true all along. "He was not yet near the stained page," I said. "He could not have been. The stain is a distraction, placed there to be found and to suggest a mechanism. The police case assumes the stain is the cause. The stain cannot be the cause, because Sir Julian never reached it." Holmes folded the sketch and returned it to his pocket. "Everything Lestrade has assembled is genuine evidence of something. The cloak fibre is real wool. The witness saw a real man in a real cloak. The items in Mordaunt's rooms represent a real state of mind. But they do not represent a real crime, not his crime. They represent a design, Watson, built upon real materials by a person who understands that the most convincing fiction is constructed almost entirely from fact." I thought of the stacked papers in Pritchard's rooms, their edges perfectly aligned, and of the room's curated appearance of unconsidered order. "He's still composing himself," I said. "Even now?" "Yes," Holmes said, "which is why I intend to ensure that the next thing he is required to compose himself against is something he is not prepared for." He rose. "I should like to speak with Sir Julian tomorrow if he's able to receive us. What he knows, and what he's willing to say, will determine a great deal about how the final act of this business proceeds." He moved to the window and looked out at the street below, where the morning traffic moved in its ordinary patterns, indifferent to the careful architecture of deception that had been built, brick by deliberate brick inside the ancient courts of the temple. "The cloak fibre," I said, following a thought. "How did it come to be in the room?" Holmes did not turn. "Planted there on the same occasion the tape was placed in Mordaunt's drawer," he said, "by a man who wore the cloak into the building, deposited one small thread in the inner room, with the precision of a man who knows that a single fibre in the right place is worth more than a cartload of circumstantial evidence, and walked out again. Mordaunt never set foot inside those chambers. He was the alibi, Watson, not the criminal. And a very well-chosen alibi he made too, angry enough, aggrieved enough, and close enough to the truth of his feelings that almost anyone would have been satisfied. Almost anyone. I looked at the chair where Lestrade had sat in his triumph and said nothing further. Chapter 8. The Mark of the Paper Knife. Sir Julian received us on the Monday morning, propped in a chair by the window of his bedroom at his house in Kensington, wrapped in a heavy dressing gown and attended by a nurse who withdrew at his quiet insistence the moment we were announced. His speech had returned in most of its facility, though it carried now a slight effortfulness, a just perceptible pause before certain words that had not been there before. He looked older than the man we'd met in the temple a fortnight ago, not merely in the physical sense, but in the way that a crisis which forces reckoning leaves its mark on the expression rather than the flesh. He listened to Holmes without interruption. Holmes did not present his conclusions. He presented, in his careful and particular manner, a series of questions, each of which required Sir Julian to confirm or correct a stated assumption. It was a method I had seen him employ when he needed information from a man of pride who would not respond well to being told what he knew. "On the morning of your collapse," Holmes began, "there was a sealed inner memorandum within the brief, separate from the main bundle. You cut it open yourself." "I did," Sir Julian said. "I had been expecting it. Certain supplementary notes were sent to me in sealed form for confidentiality." "With the paper knife?" "Yes." and afterward you set it down and continued reading, and at some point while you were reading you touched your mouth, your right hand. It is a habit you have when you are thinking." Sir Julian was quiet for a moment. "My wife has remarked upon it for 30 years, he said. The paper knife had been treated, Holmes said, not the brief. The stained page was placed there to draw attention away from the knife. The knife was the instrument." There was a long silence. Outside the window, a cart moved along the street below with the patient rhythm of an ordinary morning wholly indifferent to the extraordinary one proceeding within. "Pritchard," Sir Julian said. It was not a question. "Yes, I shall come to Pritchard presently. First, I need to understand the memorandum. Who sent it, and by what route did it reach the chambers?" Sir Julian shifted in his chair with a slight wince. "It came through the normal court correspondence. An outer envelope addressed to the chambers, an inner sealed packet marked for my personal attention. The outer envelope was unremarkable. I did not think to question it." "And the inner packet? Who handled it before you opened it?" "Harcourt brought it to my desk, but it had been sitting in the outer room for the better part of the morning. Anyone in the chambers might have handled it." Holmes nodded, and I understood him to be confirming what he already knew, rather than discovering something new. The packet had provided the opportunity. The knife had provided the mechanism. The two things together had been more than sufficient. "Now," Holmes said, and his voice carried the particular quality of a man setting down one matter and taking up another that has been waiting, "I should like to speak of Leonard Prentice." Sir Julian's expression did not collapse precisely, but something in it reorganized itself into a configuration that was less defended than what had preceded it. He looked briefly out of the window, then back at Holmes. "You know about Prentice. I know that Prentice and Pritchard are the same man. I know that you discovered this some years ago, when the relevant documents disappeared from your chambers, and that you chose not to act upon the discovery. I know that the railway bond appeal required you to introduce material that would have identified him to the court. And I know," Holmes said, without any alteration in tone, "that the letter you wrote to Lady Carrow 3 weeks ago represented a decision to speak the truth that you had declined to speak for the better part of a decade." Sir Julian said nothing for a moment. The nurse moved in the corridor outside, her footstep briefly audible and then receding. "I told myself," Sir Julian said at last, "that he was peripheral to the original fraud, young, newly called, very likely manipulated by those above him, that the damage of exposure would be disproportionate to his actual culpability." He paused. "That is what I told myself. I do not pretend it was the only consideration." "He was useful to you," Holmes said. "Not unkindly, but without softening." "He was extremely capable," Sir Julian replied. "And yes, he was useful." Holmes let that stand without comment, which was, I thought, its own form of verdict. We left Sir Julian to his nurse and his window, and the particular variety of quietude that belongs to a man who has been required to say aloud something he has carried silently for years. In the hallway, Holmes paused to collect his hat and gloves, and I asked him the question that had been forming since we entered the room. "The window latch," I said, "at the chambers. You examined it in Chapter 3 and said nothing. You have said nothing of it since." "Because it was the detail that settled everything, and I did not wish to spend it prematurely." Holmes drew on his gloves. "The latch showed recent marks, as I observed. I told Lestrade, and everyone else concluded the marks suggested an intruder. In fact, the marks were made from inside the room, not outside. The window had been opened briefly from within, not forced from without. No one entered by that window. Someone stood at it, opened it an inch or two, closed it again, and left. The marks are on the interior face of the latch, not the exterior." "To suggest that someone had come in," I said. "To create the possibility that someone had come in. Pritchard did not need the theory to be proven. He needed it to exist as an alternative. He is a lawyer, Watson. He understands that doubt, properly seeded, is almost as effective as evidence." We stepped out into the cold morning air. Holmes set off at a pace that indicated he was thinking rather than walking. I fell into step beside him. "The paper knife was wiped after use," I said, recalling the detail Holmes had noted on our first thorough examination of the room, but only on one side. Only on the side that would have borne the substance if the knife had been held in the right hand. Sir Julian is left-handed. He would have held the knife in his left. The right side of the handle would have been uppermost, not the left. Pritchard wiped the wrong side. He didn't know which hand Sir Julian used. He knew Sir Julian was left-handed in his general habits. Everyone in the chambers did. But he did not know that Sir Julian reversed this for the paper knife, a private habit, not a public one. He used the right hand for the knife because it lay to the right of the desk, and the instinct of reaching for a near object generally favours the near hand regardless of dominant preference. Pritchard assumed right-handed use. He assumed incorrectly. Holmes paused at a crossing to let an omnibus pass. "It is the nature of the elaborate crime, Watson, that the greater the care taken, the more exposed each individual assumption becomes." Pritchard prepared for every contingency he could imagine. He could not prepare for the contingency he had not imagined, which was that the man whose habits he believed he knew had one small private reversal of them. We walked on. I thought about Pritchard sitting at his desk in Bloomsbury, composing himself in his precise and orderly rooms, arranging the evidence against Mordaunt with the patient industry of a man building something he believed would hold. That evening, Holmes went to the Temple alone. He told me this afterward, in the same matter-of-fact manner with which he might report any other visit. He had gone in the early evening, gaining entry through means he described as straightforward, and which I understood to mean he had not used the front door, and he had spent rather less than an hour there. He had returned in good spirits, which in Holmes indicated satisfaction rather than pleasure. He placed on the table between us a folded document sealed with wax. "A copied memorandum," he said, in Pritchard's hand, "found precisely where I expected to find it, which was in a place sufficiently ingenious that Lestrade would not have found it, but not sufficiently ingenious that I would not." He sat. It bears Pritchard's older hand, the hand of Leonard Prentice. Set alongside the railway bond documents from the original case, it is, I think, a complete picture. He poured himself a whisky and raised it, not in celebration exactly, but with the particular quiet ease of a man who has laid down a heavy thing. "Tomorrow," he said, "we gather them." Chapter 9. The Culprit in the Wig and Gown. Holmes arranged it with the precision he brought to those moments when a case has matured sufficiently to be harvested. He sent notes on the Tuesday evening, one to Lestrade, framed as a request for his presence at Sir Julian's chambers the following morning in connection with evidence that bore directly upon the Mordaunt charge. One to Harcourt, who was asked to ensure that Miss Vane, Mr. Rudd, and Mr. Pritchard would all be present at the chambers at 10 o'clock on professional grounds that Holmes left deliberately unspecified, and one to Lady Carrow, who was invited to attend if she wished to hear something that concerned her husband's name. He sent nothing to Mordaunt, but asked me to call upon him that evening and to assure him, in Holmes's name, that he should be present. I found Mordaunt in his lodgings in a state of contained fury that had been burning at a steady temperature for several days and showed no sign of abating. He was a compact, weathered man in his late 50s, with the directness of bearing that military service either produces or destroys, and it had evidently produced it in him. He listened to my message with his arms folded and his jaw set, and then he said that if Sherlock Holmes believed he had been wronged and could prove it, he would be there, and that if Holmes could not prove it, he should say so plainly and stop wasting the time of a man who had already lost everything else. I told him, with as much confidence as I honestly possessed, that Holmes would not have sent for him otherwise. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of winter morning that London occasionally produces as though in apology for its habitual grey, with a low pale sun that put long shadows across the Temple's courtyard stones as we arrived at 9:30. Holmes had been there since 8, as Harcourt informed me in a low voice when I entered, and had spent the intervening time in Sir Julian's inner consulting room with the door closed. They assembled by 10. Miss Vane stood near her uncle's desk with her hands folded, her composure as exact as her paper sorting, though I had by now learned to read in its very exactness a form of managed distress. Old Rudd sat in the corner chair where he always sat, as though the chair itself were a form of tenure. Lady Carrow stood apart near the window, upright and watchful, and Mordaunt took a position near the door with the instinctive preference of a man who wishes to observe the room rather than be contained by it. Pritchard arrived last. He came in with his coat still buttoned against the morning cold, looked around the assembled company with an expression of polite surprise, and said that he hoped this would not take too long as he had a consultation at 11. His composure even now was remarkable. He found a chair and settled into it with the ease of a man who has told himself that what he is about to witness cannot touch him, and has believed it sufficiently to carry it in his posture. Lestrade arrived at 3 minutes past, slightly out of breath and visibly uncertain why he had been summoned away from a case he considered resolved. He positioned himself beside Holmes with the half-reluctant, half-attentive stance of a man who's been wrong before in Holmes's company, and cannot quite decide whether this is to be another such occasion. Holmes stood at the centre of the room. He did not address the assembly with any theatrical preparation. He began, as he always began, with the particular, and moved outward from it. Captain Mordaunt, he said, did not enter these chambers on the evening before Sir Julian's collapse, nor on any other occasion relevant to this matter. The witness who placed him near the temple identified his cloak, not his person, and the man observed walked without the gait impairment that Mordaunt carries from a wound received at Maiwand. The cloak was borrowed from Mordaunt's lodgings on an evening when he was known to be absent, and returned before morning. Mordaunt said nothing, but something in his face shifted by a fraction. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first loosening of a tension that had been held very tightly. The red tape found in his rooms, Holmes continued, came from an old bundle discarded from these chambers several months ago. The newspaper cuttings and the letters are Mordaunt's own, and reflect his genuine state of mind, which is one of legitimate grievance expressed with injudicious force. They were not placed. They were simply made use of, because a man who has been laying the groundwork of misdirection naturally selects the most credible available candidate, and Mordaunt's credibility as a suspect was built for him in advance by his own correspondence. Lestrade had grown very still beside the fireplace. Holmes moved to Sir Julian's desk and indicated the document box, now closed and restored to its position. The brief was not the instrument of the attack. The stained page placed within it was a distraction of considerable ingenuity, designed to draw all investigative attention to the document and away from the paper knife, which was treated with a substance applied to the handle on the side that would contact an unprotected hand. The sealed inner memorandum required Sir Julian to cut it open. He did so, set the knife down, and continued reading with the unconscious habit of touching his mouth while he thought, a habit well known to his household and his colleagues of 30 years. It was sufficient. It very nearly proved fatal. He paused. No one in the room spoke. Even Pritchard, I noted, had ceased the slight movement of one foot that had been his only visible concession to unease. The window latch, Holmes said, turning to indicate the window, was disturbed from inside, not outside. There was no intruder. The disturbance was staged to suggest one, because a skilled lawyer understands that a plausible alternative theory is worth more in a courtroom than any quantity of contradictory evidence. The cloak fibre found near the document box was deposited deliberately, during the same visit in which the paper knife was treated. One small thread, placed with precision. A single fibre in the right location, as any barrister knows, can anchor an entire police theory. He reached into his coat and withdrew the sealed document he had placed on our table 2 evenings before. He set it on the desk before him. This memorandum was recovered from Sir Julian's chambers during an examination conducted 2 evenings ago. It is a copy, made by hand, of a document from the original railway bond matter. The handwriting is that of a man named Leonard Prentice, who acted as a junior legal intermediary in the preparation of the fraudulent bond instruments 11 years ago, and who subsequently rebuilt his professional life under a different name. He looked for the first time since he had begun directly at Pritchard. The name he chose, Holmes said, was Lionel Pritchard. The room was very quiet. Outside, a door closed somewhere in the building, the sound arriving at a remove, like something belonging to a different world. Pritchard did not move immediately. He sat for a moment in the same composed attitude he had maintained throughout, and I thought, watching him, that the composure was not a performance but a reflex, the deeply ingrained response of a man who has relied upon it for so long that it had become a first rather than a second nature. Then something in it gave way, not dramatically, not with any visible collapse, but in the manner of a very fine mechanism that has been under exceptional strain and finally reaches the tolerance of its construction. "The handwriting," he said, and his voice was almost steady. "How did you match it?" "The legal gazettes carry notices of professional appointments. Your earlier career, under your former name, included a cited submission in a property matter some 14 years ago. The submission is held at the registry. The hand is the same." Holmes set the memorandum beside the law list he had also brought. "When the two documents are read together, the picture is complete. Sir Julian discovered it, as you knew he had, and you understood that the appeal would compel him, at last, to speak what he had chosen for years not to speak." Pritchard looked at the documents on the desk. Then he looked at Holmes. The composure had not returned, but something else had settled in its place, a kind of exhausted recognition, the expression of a man who has maintained a fiction for so long that its ending comes almost as a physical relief, whatever its consequences. "I did not intend," he said, "to kill him." "I know," Holmes replied. "You intended to silence him temporarily, and to ensure that the case collapsed in his absence. You're a careful man, and careful men generally do not pursue outcomes they cannot predict. But the line between temporary incapacitation and permanent harm is finer than chemistry allows, and you came very close to crossing it." Lestrade moved. He crossed the room with the professional economy of a man who's done this many times and finds no satisfaction in it, and he spoke the formal words quietly and without ceremony. Pritchard rose when asked, buttoned his coat, that final habitual gesture of a man composing himself against the cold, and went with Lestrade without resistance. Miss Vane exhaled, a long and carefully suppressed breath. Rudd looked at the floor. Mordaunt stood at the door where he had stationed himself and watched Pritchard leave with an expression from which I could not extract a single legible emotion, which seemed, under the circumstances, entirely appropriate. Lady Carrow said nothing at all, but when Holmes met her eyes across the room, she gave him a single small inclination of her head, and the quality of it was not gratitude so much as the acknowledgment between two people that a long-delayed thing has finally and at some cost been done. Chapter 10. Watson considers the brief. There is a particular quality to the days that follow the resolution of a difficult case, a kind of atmospheric decompression, as though the city itself, which has been held under some invisible pressure by the unresolved matter, gradually resumes its natural condition. I have noticed it many times over the years of my association with Holmes, and I have never entirely decided whether the sensation is objective or merely a projection of my own relief onto the indifferent streets and skies of London. Perhaps it does not matter. The effect is the same either way. The weeks that followed Pritchard's arrest were occupied with the various adjustments that justice and consequence require of the people who have lived inside a case. Sir Julian Vane recovered, though not entirely and not quickly. His speech returned to something near its former precision over the course of a month, and his physicians expressed cautious satisfaction. His reputation recovered rather less completely. The circumstances of the case, once they became known, required certain things to be said in public that he had managed for years to leave unsaid in private, and the saying of them, however inevitable, left marks. He had suppressed knowledge of Pritchard's history. He had chosen professional utility over moral obligation. These were not crimes in the legal sense, but they were failures in the human sense, and the distinction, while important, did not make the acknowledgement of them comfortable. He bore it, I thought, with more dignity than he had earned the right to expect. He appeared before the relevant authorities and gave a full account of what he had known and when, and he did not attempt to mitigate his earlier choices beyond the bare minimum that self-respect requires. He wrote a second letter to Lady Carrow, longer than the first, and I have reason to believe she read it more than once. Captain Mordaunt was released from custody on the day following the gathering in the temple, with whatever formal acknowledgement the law is able to manage in such circumstances, which is generally less than the injured party deserves and more than the institution finds comfortable. He received it with the same contained fury that appeared to be his natural register, and departed without expressing gratitude to anyone, which I found entirely understandable. A man who has been wrongly arrested and held is not obliged to be gracious about his liberation, and Mordaunt, whatever his faults of temperament, had been made a villain in a story he had not written. Holmes told me, some weeks afterward, that Mordaunt had written him a letter of 3 sentences, the first acknowledging that Holmes had cleared his name, the second stating that he considered this no more than what had been owed to him, and the third asking whether Holmes had any connection that might assist a retired officer of some experience in finding respectable employment. Holmes had replied with a name and address, and had not mentioned the exchange to me until I asked him directly. Lady Carrow's situation altered in a quieter and perhaps more lasting way. The appeal, once Pritchard's interference with the brief had been established, and the original documents restored to their full evidential weight, proceeded under the stewardship of a colleague of Sir Julian's, and the material that Sir Julian had intended to introduce was introduced. The unnamed accomplice was named. The chain of the fraud was laid out in its complete form before the court, and Sir Clement Carrow's position within it was shown to be that of a deceived investor, rather than a knowing participant. The public record, which had carried his disgrace for 2 years, was corrected. She sent Holmes a note of 4 lines, precise and warm, and a small book of verse by a poet I did not recognise. Holmes placed it on the shelf beside his chemical references without comment, which was, in its way, the sincerest form of acknowledgment he was capable of. Miss Beatrice Vane left her uncle's chambers in the early weeks of the new year. She had made her decision, Holmes told me, before Pritchard's arrest, which meant that it was not a response to the crisis but a conclusion she had reached independently of it, and which the crisis had merely confirmed. She took a position as a secretary to a firm of solicitors in the city, where by the account of Harcourt, who stayed in touch with her, she was within 3 months considered indispensable. I was not surprised. Rudd retired. He had been intending to do so for some years, and the matter of the missing documents, once it was properly aired, relieved him of the weight of a secret he had carried far too long. He was not blamed. He had been in an impossible position, and the person responsible for making it impossible was not him. Pritchard faced his proceedings without the composure that had sustained him throughout. It had been, as I had observed in that final moment in the temple, a constructed thing rather than a natural one, and constructions do not weather well once their purpose is removed. He was convicted on charges relating to the attack on Sir Julian, and the documents recovered by Holmes formed the foundation of a supplementary inquiry into the original railway bond fraud that occupied the courts for some additional months. He was not, in the end, a melodramatic villain. He was a man who had made a serious error in his youth, had spent a decade building over it, and had discovered that the structures one builds over an error are generally no more stable than the ground beneath them. Holmes, throughout all of this, returned to his usual habits with a completeness that always slightly astonished me. Within a week of Pritchard's arrest, he was immersed in a problem concerning the authentication of a Renaissance manuscript, and within a fortnight he had taken up his violin again at the hours most inconvenient to the rest of the house. He ate irregularly, kept irregular hours, and addressed correspondence from 3 foreign governments with the same selective attention he brought to Mrs. Hudson's requests that he remove his chemical apparatus from the kitchen table. It was one evening in December, a clear cold evening with frost already forming on the Baker Street railings, and the gas lamps burning bright and still in the windless air, that I raised the case with him once more. I had been thinking about it, on and off, in the way that certain cases remain present at the edge of thought long after their resolution, not because they are unfinished, but because they have deposited something that takes time to fully absorb. "The paper knife," I said. "The wrong side, wiped clean." All of that elaborate preparation, and it was one private habit he hadn't accounted for. Holmes looked up from the manuscript he was annotating. "It is almost always one thing," he said. "The elaborate crime multiplies its points of contact with the world, and each point of contact is an opportunity for an assumption to prove false. Pritchard assumed correctly about almost everything. The cloak, the fibre, the stained page, the window. He assumed incorrectly about one habit of one man's hand, and that single error was sufficient." I considered this. "It seems an unequal distribution of consequence." "On the contrary," Holmes said, returning to his manuscript, "it is a perfectly just one. The more carefully a thing is built, the more each component matters. A structure held together by many pins may lose one without collapse. A structure that depends upon precision at every joint fails at the first joint that is imprecise." He made a notation in the margin. "Pritchard was not undone by bad luck, Watson. He was undone by the fact that he did not know Sir Julian as well as he believed he did. 30 years in a man's chambers, and he did not know which hand he used for a paper knife. What we know of a person and what we assume we know are two very different bodies of knowledge, and most people never discover the gap between them until it has cost them something." The fire settled. Somewhere outside, a cab moved along Baker Street with the comfortable sound of iron wheels on cold stone. "The case turned on observation," I said after a while. "Not violence, not confession, not accident. Observation." Holmes set down his pen. He looked at the fire for a moment with the expression of a man reviewing something internally before choosing to release it. "Reason," he said, "is not the art of seeing more than other men. It is the discipline of refusing to see less." He took up his pen again. I opened my notebook and began, in the quiet of that December evening, to write down what I remembered from the beginning: the fog upon the embankment, a nervous young clerk with ink-stained fingers, a thick bundle of papers tied with red tape, and Holmes standing at the window of Baker Street listening to a city that was afraid to speak. It had spoken in the end, through the wrong side of a paper knife, and the silence of a man who had never thought to ask whether his colleague would recover, and the small, irreducible fact of a single habit that belonged to Sir Julian Vane alone, and which no amount of careful preparation had succeeded in anticipating. It had spoken, and Holmes had heard it. That, I have always thought, is the whole of the matter.